Note, I've never played IM2R, and for that reason you will see no comparison to Samus Returns in this review. At this point we can't even consider this a remake anymore. The level and game design of Samus Returns is so different from Metroid 2. Actually, the game is closer to an inspiration of Return of Samus than an actual remaster. Nintendo could have simply made a lazy 2.5D rehash of the original, but they didn't. After being tentatively introduced following Nintendo's E3 Direct, the few glances we got of the game had left me feeling skeptical. I was, and still am, getting tired of 3DS games. Not only because the console is almost 7 years old and outdated, but because Nintendo just released a fresh and new console this March with actual decent hardware. At least decent enough to run an ambitious new Metroid game. Since Prime 4 was also announced barely a few hours before on console, I guess I don't have any reason to be upset. I could at least get a taste of a new Metroid game for the first time in 7 years. And in the end, here I am now, praising the hell out of this game like I've never played a better 2D Metroid game ever before. I'm not going to spend too much time analyzing the graphic difference between Metroid 2 and Samus Returns, as there are definitely tons of videos and reviews that are entirely dedicated to that. I think even someone blind would be able to differentiate between those two screenshots. We jump from a confined 2D and monochrome world to a 2.5D mess of corridors and a sea of opportunities. And obviously the controls are slicker than ever, and definitely more so than on the Game Boy. Samus' firm yet fluid jumps and movements are closer to a perfect mix of the best from Metroid Zero Mission and Super Metroid. At the same time, we've got the ability to grab ledges and to move Samus like in the Game Boy Advance games, but with larger aiming options closer to Super Metroid's freedom of movement, without the clumsy switches between missiles, bombs and everything else using select from this game. Except for the first time in history of this franchise, you can actually aim precisely wherever you want to on the screen. Obviously, after over 10 years of technological advancement, that was a logical conclusion, but it's precise enough to make you seriously think back on how limited the past games were in their aiming, even if shooting isn't the core quality of Metroid. But now, since your movements are now way more controllable, it also follows that targets are easier to hit. To compensate for that, the developers at Mercury Steam made it so that it's now way harder. Not in a fake difficulty kind of way, a more subtle and more cohesive way. Enemies don't stagger anymore whenever you hit them, which led to a lot of game-breaking manipulation in the past games. Here you'll have to fight bosses relying on your jump and shooting skills, while at the same time using your brain. Just like old times, but now with a modern game design mindset. And it's pretty crazy that they managed to keep the same kind of control scheme of back then but implemented it in this generation. Oh, and you'll also want to take breaks sometimes. After 7 consecutive hours of playing, I could barely feel my left finger since you press the L button so much. At least on a classic Nintendo 3DS XL. But that's okay, because the game kicks ass. Another thing that people have been upset about is the counter system. In short, when an enemy is about to attack you, by pressing X you can counter the attack and stun the enemies. This throws up a little bit of disappointment for some fans, and trust me, I too was skeptical about this idea. But the feature ends up being pretty optional, hence why I ended up barely using the feature at all. Yeah, sure, it helped me to avoid spending hours on high defense normal enemies or wasting missile ammo on them, but other than that, it's only occasionally used against a few rare boss fights, and it isn't even necessary to beat them. Also, I stuck too much to the game and wasn't used to the counter enough for me to actually use it against the weakest enemies, so that's pretty much it. Despite all of those battle changes, the game is definitely not combat focused. Exploration is still the center of the game, and good lord, this game is smart. Exploration takes a different turn in this game, emphasizing puzzle solving to reach items more than simply shooting everywhere, hoping you will be able to find something worthwhile, but I'll get to that later on. I honestly think we're almost on the level of Super Metroid. Taking aside how groundbreaking this game was back then, I don't think Samus Returns will have any real impact in the game industry at all, but it definitely managed to reach the pinnacle of the 2D series. A few people might be disappointed with how lacking the new content might be, but hey, it's supposed to be a remake. And I think it already drifted way further from the original Metroid 2 to give us a more varied and interesting playstyle than that of the original, while still freshening things up a little bit, enough that it almost feels like a new entry worthy of 2017. For this reason, I'm definitely rooting for the developers to make a completely new 2D Metroid game, instead of a teased Metroid Fusion remake. First of all, because Fusion, Super Metroid and Zero Mission aged well enough for anyone to pick these games up and barely have any problem with them. The level design is clearer, bigger, and way more free to explore than Metroid 2's tedious level design could ever be. I can't blame it though, I mean it's a Game Boy game. You can see the map on the bottom screen, which avoids you having to press start to check it and waste some time looking at the dull and empty map from back then. Now, everything you come across will be pretty much shown down here, which leads to way less confusion while browsing the digital map or while exploring it yourself, without needing to use the dumbest of hints. You can also put markers on the map now, for whatever reasons you need to. Though I do think 10 marks per level is pretty restricting, it's not like you need them that much, but they're always welcome additions. The good old feel of progression and power of Samus throughout the over 8 hours of the game is here and intact, and better than ever. I still can't believe I spent 11 hours on this game and 100%ed it in barely 2 days, something that never happened to me on a Metroid game ever before. I was literally hooked, and it has a perfect tone which never leaves you too bored or wanting more, all the while keeping a perfectly balanced difficulty. Except for you digger-nut asshole. There are also 4 new unique skills in this game, which consumes your yellow gauge that depletes upon use of said skills. I'm not really gonna spoil them for you, but the first one we get is a sort of scanner like the one in Super Metroid. Except this time around it's actually pretty damn useful, and it almost made the game for me. Super Scanner was extremely slow and only worked within a certain radius of blocks, but here, just by pressing one button at the cost of a part of your yellow gauge, it operates within a good chunk of the level. Not only does it display missed bits of maps, but it also helps you find destroyable blocks. In the older Metroid games, if you wanted to finish the game at 100%, most of the time you will scan an item on the map, then proceed to bomb the hell out of the walls, hoping you'll find something or realize you don't have enough upgrades to get it and then move on. Though I'm not necessarily bothered by this system, it does ruin the sense of immersion a little bit. However, this new mechanic in Samus Returns isn't some kind of magic button that just plays itself, and nothing will stop you from getting to the items in the old-fashioned way anyway. Even if using the skill just slightly depletes the skill gauge, the items aren't just scattered in blocks anymore. Usually they're destroyable blocks that lead to some secret paths with little puzzle in them. Now the difficulty doesn't lie in finding them, but in acquiring them. Sometimes it can be achieved by using certain powers, sometimes you'll have to use Samus' physical skills. They're short but interesting little trials. Similarly to Breath of the Wild Sanctuaries, these puzzles are really limited to just one answer, which left me with a lot of ways to solve them. I'm not a smart guy, and sometimes I just had fun trying to morph bomb my way through certain places, or will jump like a madman like I did in Zero Mission. Though obviously using the right powers make it well easier. And then the game suddenly becomes a real pleasure to explore. A pleasure I rarely experienced, because first of all I'm not a completionist, and second of all because Samus Returns makes this so much more enjoyable. Mercury's team managed to keep a good classic 2D vibe, and at the same time polished and paid to the maximum amount of attention to every detail. Everything is now so much more accessible, be it for the most impatient people who dislike one-way puzzles, or people simply looking for a direct, linear experience without having to pay too much attention to fetch quests and collectibles. And I'm both of these people, so it's surprising that it instead helped me to get further away from this mindset, and actually hyped me up to find everything possible. My entire playthrough felt like a giant treasure hunt, and I couldn't let go of my console for 2 days straight. Results are, I never had to check an external guide for the game, while as far as I love the hell out of Super Metroid and Fusion, I'm not gonna lie, but often find myself completely stuck until I watched a walkthrough to find out that I needed to use a morph bomb to destroy an underwater bridge and go, how was I supposed to know that? Or didn't have to go full Michael Bay on everything possible just to find one poor missile upgrade. From an artistic point of view, the game is still pretty simple and classic looking for today's standards, but I'm gonna defend it by saying that the Game Boy game is pretty lacking in graphic details and they just filled the holes accordingly or logically. And the amount of background details such as cool-ass giant lizards in the distance are enough to keep me entertained anyway. The music might feel way less memorable than it did in Super Metroid with Flower Brainstorm, theme of Samus and such, but it still has some good remixes. They almost completely changed the original music of the original game, so it could be less aggressive considering how eerie some melodies were in the Game Boy game. It's pretty hard to depict any real flaws in the game, but I'm still a bit sad that the game is in 2.5D instead of perfectly crafted 2D pixel art style. But there's already AM2R, so it's not too bad, and it's good to see something that feels more modern. But you can really feel how limited 3DS feels now. At least the frame rate is stable, so I don't really have any technical complaints. Switch would have been better, but it's not too bad as the 3DS at least has one good Metroid game, and it's a good entry to start the series with if you've never tried it yet, and since literally everyone has a 3DS, it's cool. Atmosphere isn't as haunting as Fusion, but it's definitely up there. They even added a shitload of new content to the game, and you're in for a real treat if nothing got spoiled for you. In short, Samus Returns completely annihilates the original. If we were to compare it to in painting, the Game Boy episode feels like a sketch, and the 3DS one feels like an inked and colored complete piece. Sure, it wasn't too hard considering how Return of Samus badly aged, but Samus Returns implemented so many new elements that it's oddly to say that it's just a simple remake. Backtracking is now fairly rare, but going back to zones to pick up items you might have missed doesn't feel like a core anymore, which makes the game way more addicting. I couldn't let go of it for 48 hours and was able to finish it at 100% like a madman without realizing I spent more than 10 hours of playing it. I can't wait for another 2D Metroid game, and I hope that the next episode will have an even better artistic direction, and on the Switch instead of the 3DS, please. We're this close to getting a flawless 2D Metroid game, it will be a shame to stop here. I just hope Mercury's team will work on a sequel and not a Metroid Fusion remake though. I'm glad Metroid Prime is still alive and kicking, but to be honest, the 2D episodes have always stood out to me. So please, buy this game to show support, and to make Nintendo understand that we want classic Metroid games. Thank you so much for watching until the end. Feel free to leave me your thoughts on the review in the comments. I really want to produce the best kind of content, and I could do with as many suggestions and critiques as I can get. And if you enjoyed it, you can always share this video to show your support, or follow me on Twitter. I'll see you around.